I talked about the history of our country and to put it into the composite. It's America became like a giant petri dish with almost, historically, it would be as close to perfect as we've seen, of having all the elements for a free and robust nation coming together almost simultaneously with the concept of manifest destiny. And so that was in the minds of our founding fathers. And so we settled the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea, in the blink of an historical eye. And that foundation that is our country today is rooted on a number of things, which I mentioned, but certainly in the center from the immigration perspective, this is the rule of law. And our founding fathers took the trouble to write into the Constitution an enumerated power for Congress to regulate immigration. And so when those laws are violated, it erodes the rule of law, it erodes the laws of the nation, it erodes the respect for our supreme law of the land, the Constitution. And we move closer to becoming a lawless nation rather than a law-abiding and lawful nation. So for me, the center of the immigration policy is some of it rooted in my upbringing. My father was he was in law enforcement. He managed state police radio stations around the state, and he educated me in the Constitution and the law. At the supper table at night would be the Constitution and the Code of Iowa, and then so that was a pretty strong message to receive. Not every night, but many nights, and so I've carried that forward into where I sit now as the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee and the House Judiciary Committee. And again, at the center of this, it's always been about the rule of law. And so when, maybe another way to explain this would be in 1986 when Ronald Reagan signed the '86 Amnesty Act. I'd been watching the debates. We didn't have C-SPAN then, but the news stories on it and on television and in the print paper about the debate in the House and the Senate. And even though I'll say the rule of law lost that debate in the House and the Senate, their argument was, well, we have 1 million people in America that are here illegally, and that's too many to deal with. Why don't we just grant them amnesty, and then we'll promise that we'll enforce the law from here on out, and there'll never be another amnesty again, where we're just going to end this thing with the amnesty now. And I believed it was profoundly wrong to reward people that were breaking the law and that it would create more lawbreakers. And I believed that in 1986. And then when Ronald Reagan, I expected though that Reagan would veto the bill because he was such a principled man, he would understand with utter clarity that that if he signed the Amnesty Act, it would be a reward and it wouldn't really be the end of it. And but he signed it instead of vetoing it. And I've told people publicly, I remember I was standing in my construction office, and when I heard that on the radio, that the frustration hit me, and I kicked a dent in my cheap filing cabinet. And because I knew that we would have to then go to work trying to restore the respect for the rule of law, and it would be much, much more difficult. We had the chance to do that in '86, and if Ronald Reagan had held his ground and vetoed the Amnesty Act and insisted on enforcing the law, we would have saved so much human grief and suffering, so much angst on inside the United States and outside the United States. So that's the center of it. And I look back on this, and I've had this conversation with Reagan's Attorney General, Ed Meese, who is, he's active in this town yet, and I count him as a friend. But he has told me that, well, we know historically that Ronald Reagan recanted his position on amnesty, and Ed Meese has told me that he regrets that he and other members of the cabinet advised Reagan to sign it, that was a mistake that started us down this path. So that's the center of it. And well, it's pretty easy. Our founding fathers gave us a means to amend the Constitution, and that's if we don't like the policy that emanates from that Constitution, then we should amend it. And when we do amend it, I accept it, I embrace it. It is the supreme law of the land, without hesitation. And so I don't have any trouble with that. And the immigration laws that we have are clear. When law enforcement encounters people who are unlawfully present in America, the law requires that they place them into removal proceedings. That's one, ignoring that law is one of the reasons that we have such a big problem in this country today. Well, the first thing we need to do is restore the respect for the rule of law. That's been more than a 30-year endeavor on my part. And I'm not advocating that we change any laws that would provide for amnesty, and that because we have to restore the respect for the rule of law. But we're on the cusp of being able to do that. And I think that if the Trump administration actually does enforce immigration law and reject the unconstitutional policies that have been created by Barack Obama, and when I use that word unconstitutional, that's also his definition of his actions. I think it's the first time we've had a president define a constitutional violation and then go ahead and violate it by his own definition. I don't think that's ever happened in the history of this country. But I think that there's a time that, say 3 to 5 years down the road, if the laws are enforced effectively and the respect for the law is reestablished. And you know, you just can't conceive of what it was like when the law was respected, because you never lived in that era, and at least not in your adult time when you're paying attention to what's going on. And so, but 3 to 5 or more years down the road, I can't really determine how long that might be. It depends on how effective we are. But once the rule of law is respected, then there's room, and there will be some people. Pick your number. I don't believe it's 11 million people in the country illegally. When I came to this town 14 years ago, the numbers of illegal in America were 12 million. And they keep coming across the border, and the number's gone down. For 14 years, they keep pouring across the border, the number's gone down. I think that's not going to be right. I think that number's closer to 20 million. But regardless of the number, if the law is enforced, there will be people who will make the decision to go home again. And there will be, I'll say, several million. I don't know how many. But also, I anticipate there will be those whose roots go down so deep that they're going to stay no matter what. Well, they came here to live in the shadows. And so if they're living in the shadows and not violating any of our laws and not being encountered by law enforcement, then that was their choice when they came here. That was their objective, was to come here and live in the shadows. And so the remaining those who do that, fine, let them do so peacefully, as long as they're not encountered by law enforcement. And that way we are restoring the respect for the rule of law. We've got a decent amount of humanity for those that are left, and then America can prosper again. But it puts us in a position where we can create, for the first time, an immigration policy. And this is another, first restore the respect for the rule of law, then establish an immigration policy that's designed to enhance the economic, the social, and the cultural well-being of the United States of America. Any country's immigration policy should be to enhance your country. There are only between 7 and 11% of our legal immigration that comes into America that does so based upon their merit to contribute to our country. And the rest of those, so that would be between 89 and 93% of America, of legal immigrants coming into America, don't have to demonstrate that they have anything that they would do to contribute to America. It's familial, family reunification plan, chain migration, the visa lottery, those kind of things. So a smart nation would do that in the opposite, and we're a long ways from there. It's going to take a long ways to get there. But I know that there are thinking people in this administration that understand what I've just described. I think that the people that are here illegally need to go home to the countries where they can live legally. And so that's all I need to comment about that. I want to restore the respect for the rule of law. And if you adhere to the principle of the rule of law, then the qualifications of people that are here illegally are irrelevant. Okay. That's my view. And but the legal immigration policy that we have, then once we restore the respect for the rule of law, and once we, I'll say, virtually end illegal immigration in this country, and then we can upgrade the standards so that we're bringing people here that can contribute to America. And think of this, we're about 320 million people in this country.
Mm-hmm.
There are 103 million Americans who are not in the workforce, and they are of working age not in the workforce. When you start subtracting from that 103 million those that are too old to work, those are disabled, that take them out, we get down to about 82 million Americans who would be available if we were going to mobilize our workforce like we did in World War II. So if there are 82 million Americans that are an available workforce, some of them in a pinch, but that's still a big universe to draw from, then what nation in its right mind would import people from other countries under the false statement that there's work that Americans won't do? That's simply never been true. It's been an excuse, but not a reason. And so we should draw from those 82 million Americans that are there. And we have over 70 different federal means-tested welfare programs in America. And we were borrowing money from China to bribe Americans not to work so they can sit on the couch instead of go on the assembly line and punch the time clock. And that wasted human resource, and if you look at our inner cities, the people there that grow up generation after generation, we're 3 or so generations into the war on poverty in our inner cities. And I go there and I look and I meet with people and I talk to them, and I'd love to see the inner cities lifted up. And I'm really glad that President Trump went up near Detroit to lift up the manufacturing center again. But we need to put the people in America back to work. And because big business, especially huge franchises, wants cheap labor to clean the hotel rooms and wait the tables in their restaurants and do those kind of things. They want that cheap labor. They've been pressing politically, and some of it through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's been breaking down the rule of law in this country, and it erodes our society. And one of the things, national policy-wise, needs to be anybody's job that serves in a legislative body anywhere, but I'll say especially here in the United States Congress. Our job needs to be to bring about policy that increases the per capita GDP of our people. Mm-hmm. Any individual that gets off the couch and goes to work contributes to the GDP, and when they do so, they're taking themselves off of being a dependent, a load on other producers, and making themselves a producer. They go from a minus in our economy to a plus in our economy. And we should encourage all of that we can, and we should recognize also that all work has dignity. And there are starter level jobs, and I've had a number of them. And I'll just say this, those starter level jobs are inspirational to people to climb their way up the economic ladder. When my youngest son, Jeff King, we set him off to run scraper on a job, and he came back and he'd worked about 70 hours that week in 100-degree heat with no air moving. And when he came home and came into the house, his mother said, "Well, Jeff, how was your week?" And, "Well, what'd you learn this week?" And his answer was, "I learned what I don't want to do for a living." Well, I go down to the border and I see what's going on down there. And if that data is accurate, it's very recent data. I know that they do some analysis that gets pretty sophisticated in where people are, but I think there are a lot more people living in the shadows than they're able to find. We don't have a means of counting the people that are going back. And we don't do a very good job of counting the people coming in. We've long said that if we interdict a certain number of people, they use that as an estimate of how many people are actually coming across the border illegally. I've spent a good number of nights down there sitting on the border watching it happen and listening in the dark and having it flow around me, and I've been part of the interdictions of illegal drugs and drug smuggling, and I'm aware of the people who, I call them people we call them people of interest from nations of interest, which we might just shorthand that and say those who may or likely are inclined to be terrorists. That's all going on. 80 to 90% of the illegal drugs consumed in America come from or through Mexico. And we are losing a number, someplace I think between 47,000 and 52,000 Americans die to drug overdose each year. Much of that is the opioid epidemic. Some of that is prescription, much of that is smuggled heroin into the United States. And so when I look at that data, plus Central Americans are pouring across the border in numbers that are very close to their peak right now. And so it isn't just a question of Mexican illegal immigration coming into America, but it's the big question of contraband, primarily drugs, and also, likely terrorists coming across, and Central Americans coming in that are harder to deport because we don't have an agreement with some of those countries on taking their illegal aliens back. So we need to secure that border. It's a great threat to our national security, and the economics temporarily have slowed down the Mexican migration into America. I agree with that. But still, of the population of illegal aliens in America, 2/3 of them are Mexican, and that population is, well, 2/3. That's well, when we're using the word in this discussion, immigrant, interchangeably with legal and illegal.
Okay.
And we've got to separate that.
Right.
It's because the legal immigration is something that America has long celebrated, and I celebrate.
Mhm.
And I go speak at naturalization services whenever I can. And it's a really joyous time and an uplifting feeling. And I always ask them, you know what date it is today? And they will tell me. This is because the rest of your life you'll remember this date that you became an American. And
Yeah.
so that's the difference. And so if that part of that universe are illegal aliens that are working in these jobs, and when the day comes that they're no longer in America, in Iowa or in America, those jobs will be filled some way. I mean, and so what has happened is, and I've watched this happen. I mean, when I grew up in high school in Denison, I was born in Storm Lake. Both of those towns are packing plant towns. And I watched, for example, when a high-grade packing plant, be now probably 30 years ago, it was functioning, and it was, I'll say, the community was vibrant, and the people working the line in that plant were making the equivalent of a teacher with a college education. But it shifted the other way, and when the plant went under, partly because wages were a little too high to compete, I expect, but when IBP bought that plant, Iowa Beef Packers bought that plant and opened it back up, they began to recruit labor out of southern Mexico. They had billboards up in southern Mexico, and they cleaned out sometimes whole small communities of adult young men who came up to work in the plant. They were illegal aliens. Iowa Beef Packers hired them, and they cut the wages in about half. So there are these guys doing the same work that their predecessors had been doing. The teachers were making twice as much as they were now, and IBP got a discount on cheap labor. Now, if we had secured our borders and enforced our immigration laws then we were gonna process hogs, and we're gonna process cattle and turkeys and chickens, and that's all going to happen because people are gonna eat. So what do if we need more people to work in the plant? You raise wages and you go out and you recruit. If you're going to recruit Americans, they probably would have gone to the inner city and offered wages and recruited people and brought them in. Well, that would have been Americans working on the line that were American citizens or green card holders on the way to becoming an American citizen, and then the rule of law in this country would look entirely different. But because there was a blind eye that was turned as far back as 30 years ago, and I haven't been just critical of Barack Obama on this. George W. Bush and I went round and round on the topic, and I've said that really ever since Eisenhower, the immigration laws in this country have been enforced less and less, and Barack Obama took it to another level. But that's where we set. They have eroded the rule of law in this country, and it threatens to drag us down into third world eventually if we don't do this. So we want to stay the first of the first world Western civilization countries, a beacon for the world. And we can't do that without the rule of law.